Working the night shift at the local radio station, I've grown accustomed to the quiet hum of equipment, the soft glow of dials, and the lonely silence that stretches between broadcasts. My job, while often mundane, has its moments of intrigue, particularly when sifting through old records and forgotten archives. One evening, as I was rummaging through a dusty storage room, I stumbled upon a tape marked simply with the date August 17th, 1985. Curiosity piqued. I dusted off the old cassette and slipped it into the player. A scratchy, low hum filled the studio before the voice of a long-forgotten host emerged, discussing a series of mysterious disappearances in a town nearby. Intrigued by the chilling nature of the content, I decided to feature the tape on my late-night show, Mystic Mysteries. As the clock struck midnight, I introduced the segment, setting the eerie tone for my listeners. Tonight, we delve into the mystery from the past, a chilling account of vanishes that left a town in terror. This is a broadcast from August 17th, 1985 that was never aired. Until now. I pressed play, and the haunting voice of the past host echoed through the studio and out across the airwaves. The town of Cold Hollow has been plagued by unexplained disappearances. One by one, residents vanish without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of strange sounds and fleeting shadows. As the tape played, I noticed an odd distortion in the audio, a faint background noise that resembled a mix of static and distant whispers. I adjusted the controls, but the strange sound persisted. Calls started coming in from listeners, all reporting the same thing, unsettling noises and eerie visions that seemed to emanate from their radios. At first, I dismissed it as collective imagination, perhaps influenced by the spooky content of the broadcast. But then, I saw it myself. A shadowy figure reflected in the studio window, there one moment, gone the next. Whatever was on the tape was more than just a recording. It was something alive, something malevolent. The host on the tape continued, recounting the disappearance of an entire family. The Johnsons were last seen entering their home, but by morning, they were gone. Neighbors reported hearing strange chanting and seeing flickering lights in the woods behind their house. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as the lights in the studio began to flicker. Desperate, I tried to stop the tape, but the controls wouldn't respond. It was as if the equipment had a mind of its own, determined to play the recording to the end. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and a shadow in the window reappeared, this time closer. Fighting rising terror, I grabbed the microphone. If anyone is listening, turn off your radios now. There's something wrong with this broadcast. But it was too late. My voice was drowned out by a cacophony of whispers and static, and the tape rolled on. The town's priests believed the disappearances were a work of a vengeful spirit, awakened by a desecrated grave. He conducted an exorcism, but the entity only grew stronger, feeding on the fear it created. The shadow moved through the studio, a shapeless mass of darkness that seemed to pulsate with malevolent energy. I could feel it watching me, drawing closer with each passing second. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in the cold air. In a desperate bid to end the broadcast, I yanked the tape from the player, but the whispers continued, now emanating from the very walls of the studio. The shadow loomed over me, a tangible sense of dread passing down on my chest. It spoke in a voice that was a chorus of agony and despair.
You have opened the door, and now you must pay the price.
My vision blurred, and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness. Summoning all my strength, I managed to grab a metal chair and swung it at the window, shattering the glass. Cold night air rushed in, breaking the hold of the entity for a brief moment. I stumbled out of the studio, the whispers fading as I put distance between myself and the cursed tape. The radio station was shut down the next day, officially due to technical difficulties. But I knew the truth. The tape had unleashed something terrible, something that should have remained buried. I left town, abandoning my career in radio, haunted by the knowledge that that spirit might still be out there, waiting for its next victim. To anyone that finds the tape marked August 17th, 1985, I beg you, destroy it. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't let the darkness in. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I sat in our dark room, the computer screen glaring with a harsh white light. A banner flashed before my eyes. Seek wisdom by understanding yourself. Chloe, check this out. I called over my shoulder to my girlfriend playing The Sims on her laptop. She glanced up, her brow furrowing in confusion before giving me a bemused look. What the hell are you looking at? She asked. It's some cult, I replied, unable to hide my fascination. I fell down a rabbit hole and found this local place downtown. It's a derivative of Aleister Crowley and Golden Dawn bullshit. I pointed to the Google Street View image of a dilapidated storefront in an ethnic shopping center. She smirked, a hint of amusement in her eyes. I never pegged you as the religious type. Check this out. I continued clicking through the site. They have some photos. Most were taken in an odd room with black and white checkered floors, adorned with Egyptian pseudo-artifacts, bathed in the glow of red and purple lights that transformed the scene into a surreal dreamscape. The people certainly had an alternative vibe. Tattoos were plentiful, but other than that, they looked like they came from all different walks of life. Many of them looked like they had their fair share of bullying in high school, no shortage of that. But most of them looked relatively normal aside from the occasional piercing. One photograph in particular caught my eye. A woman sitting in a bright red room sat on an altar, holding a staff in her right hand, wearing nothing. A man was kneeled before her, his arms tied behind him, rope anchored to the ceiling. They were sliding a knife down his back, a small trickle of blood dripping to the floor. Damn, Chloe started. She's butt-ass naked. You want to go? I asked. They're having a get-together tonight. You know what? Fuck it. Why not? It's not like we're doing anything, she replied. Good. I smiled, standing up. Because I already ordered an Uber. She signed before opening the door and pulling out a small pipe. I'll go, but I'm not going sober. It was a cold, shitty Seattle winter night. We got dropped off in a parking lot and spent the next few minutes looking for the storefront. We finally found it next to a dog groomer and a pho restaurant with some pun for a name I can't seem to remember. We entered the shop, which consisted of 2 narrow aisles separated by wooden shelves barely enough for me to fit down. We spent some time looking at various items, my attention diverting to a vial of elk blood. I remember wondering if they were even allowed to sell this without some type of medical certification they definitely did not have, while Chloe shuffled through a bowl of mix and match crystals. Can I help you? I heard a woman say from the back as she emerged from a beaded curtain. She was a short, overweight woman wearing what I could only describe as a sports bra and a hula skirt. Hi, I stuttered. I'm George and this is Chloe. We're here for the winter solstice celebration? Oh, goody. Newcomers, she said with an out-of-place, overjoyed expression as she clapped her hands. Chloe and I laughed nervously. The door is in the back, but you can come through here just this time, she said with a smile, arm holding the beaded curtain open. We walked through the dark hallway, somehow more cramped than the shop, into a rather large room. A gaggle of people were huddled in the back, which Chloe and I quietly shuffled into. A bearded man paraded around the room, white robes and red headdress cascading into a cloak, knuckles adorned with several large rings gripping a spear held vertically in front of him. Behind him, another bald man, white robes and yellow cloak, followed behind, white sleeves crossed over his chest. I glanced at Chloe's bloodshot eyes, THC clearly flowing through her system. I gave her a knowing look as if to say, having fun yet? She returned a slow smile. Without warning, the entire crowd clapped their hands together over their heads as a woman in blue robes walked past, waving a censer leaking white smoke. We awkwardly followed to match the group. The blue curtains on the back wall opened to reveal an older Asian woman sitting perched on the altar I saw in the photos again, completely naked. And before you ask, no, she wasn't attractive. It's never the ones you hope it is. The red-robed man kneeled down and softly kissed her knees. I glanced back at Chloe. Her smile was so big I was afraid she was going to laugh at any moment. I pinched her on the side and whispered into her ear, "Do not fucking laugh." Honestly, I think I made it worse. Her face turned beet red as she bit her cheeks. The ritual went on for another hour or so. They must have said, "Do what thy will shall be the whole of the law," at least a dozen times. We were getting kind of bored and were ready to leave before the woman in the blue robes wandered in with a caged chicken. No fucking way, I thought. Surely enough, the man in the yellow robes held the chicken high in the air before slitting its throat and draining the blood into a large metallic basin. The man winced as the chicken flailed violently, scratching up his arms before eventually succumbing to blood loss. One by one, each person there stood between a white and black pillar saying love and intention in Greek before eating a piece of something, taking a sip of blood, and saying, "There is no part of me that is not of the gods." Chloe and I hung back and politely declined when our turn came. Once all was said and done, they busted out some alcohol and started celebrating. We slipped into the street, bursting out laughing. After we finally collected ourselves, Chloe whipped out her phone and showed me she took dozens of pictures of the ritual. We laughed our asses off the entire way home. First thing she did was open her laptop and post the pictures on Twitter, tagging the lodge with the caption, "Me and the boys chillin' right now." We returned to the usual rhythm of our lives. I went to work conducting meetings and answering emails, while Chloe went back to her classes. A few days later, Chloe checked her Twitter and saw she gained a few thousand likes. The whole ordeal became a running joke between us. I would eat my fruit snacks and sip on my soda saying, "There is no part of me that is not of the gods." A few weeks later, we had mostly forgotten about it, except for the occasional recounting of a funny story to regale our friends. One night, while Chloe and I were spending our evening the usual way with me on the computer and her on her laptop, I felt her furiously tapping my shoulder while staring wide-eyed at the window. Confused, I took off my headphones and walked over, pulling back the curtain to reveal 6 people standing in black robes and animal masks, watching us from the hillside. "What do we do? Should I call the cops?" Chloe whimpered. "No, they're just a bunch of LARPers. They're not gonna do shit. Just trying to scare us," I said angrily as I closed the blinds and hopped back on my computer. Chloe sat there for a few minutes in a tense pose with her arms folded together. She went to double check the door was locked before we continued our night as normal. The next day, I got a text from Chloe frantically telling me to come home immediately. When I arrived, there was a squad car parked outside our building. I ran up the stairs to see 2 officers standing by Chloe in the doorway. I nearly shouted asking what was going on. They led me inside to show me a massive black symbol drawn on our wall, a 6-pointed star made from one continuous line. We finished our police report, and they told us they'd get back to us if they find anything. We've been robbed often enough to know what that means. They're going to forget about this before they've even gotten back into their squad car. Furious, I stormed over to the shop and banged on the window. The hula skirt woman came over and cracked the door open just enough for me to see one of her eyes. "What the fuck do you think your little posse is doing?" I screamed at her. "Breaking into my apartment like that? You all are fucking psychos." "I haven't any idea what you're talking about," she said with a sly grin. "Oh yeah?" I said, pointing my finger in her face. "If anyone tries any shit like this again, I'm going to burn your goddamn shop to the ground. Do you hear me?" She looked at the ground, clearly nervous. I had never blown up at a stranger like this, but I could tell my threats were working. After a moment of silence, I stormed off again, back towards home. "You meddled in forces you do not understand," she called out from the shop. I picked up a glass bottle from the sidewalk and chucked it, smashing it against her shop window, forcing her to close the door and disappear into the shadows. I'm not particularly proud of how I behaved in this moment, but unless you've had someone break into your home and draw some shit on the walls, hold on to your judgment. The next few days passed without so much as a peep from them. Chloe and I began to relax, convincing ourselves that the cult had been scared off. Life seemed to be returning to normal, and the unsettling incident became just another story. I've always been drawn to the darker corners of the internet. Not the dark web, just obscure websites and blogs with next to no users. That's how I stumbled upon the 13th floor ritual. It was just a post on an obscure forum, but it promised an experience beyond anything imaginable. A glimpse into a world that defied explanation, with the promise of good fortune for those who followed the ritual steps correctly. I've archived the post, and while I won't link it here at this time, it reads as follows. 1. Find a building with at least 13 floors. It must have an elevator that can access all floors without restrictions. 2. Begin the ritual at 1 in the morning. This is 1 hour past midnight, also known as the true 13th hour. 3. Enter the elevator alone. If anyone else gets on, you must wait and start over. 4. Press the buttons in ascending order, starting with 1 all the way through 13, stopping on each floor. You must not proceed if the elevator stops on any floor where you did not press a button. 5. When you reach the 13th floor, the doors will open to a hallway that doesn't exist in our realm. You may see figures in the distance. Do not, for any reason, interact with them or show fear. 6. Leave an object of personal significance in the hallway. The greater the significance, the greater the fortune. This is your offering. 7. Return to the elevator and do not for any reason turn around. Press the button for the first floor. If the elevator begins ascending instead, immediately press any other floor's button to disrupt the ascent. 8. Exit the building immediately after reaching the first floor. Do not look back. Do not go back, ever. If you've made it past the final step, congratulations. You may now begin to experience good fortune. You can thank me later. Regards, M. After reading this, I called up my buddy, who I will refer to as Steve in this story for the sake of anonymity. Steve and I go way back, and both of us have enjoyed trying outlandish internet cemeteries in order to document the results. It's a sort of hobby we shared since middle school. Everything we had ever done before this had unsurprisingly ended in disappointing results, which is why it was no surprise when Steve initially declined my invitation to join me on this particular excursion. Nah, man, I don't think so. I mean, thanks for the offer, but Kristen's mom's visiting from Vermont this weekend, and she needs me to help her move some furniture to get her apartment ready, he told me. Plus, the post you sent says that only one person is allowed to perform the ritual, and it's not like anything ever happens anyway. Of course nothing happens, I chuckled in reply. But the fun is in the experience. Come on, man. There's no way I'm going into an old building at night by myself. You can just use the stairs to meet me at each floor. I don't know, man. That furniture... Nobody moves furniture at night, Steve. You just don't want Kristen's mom to find out about your little hobby. Isn't that it? Maybe, Steve signed. I could hear the hesitation in his voice. I knew I had him. Come on, Steve. We'll both be going off to college in the fall. We gotta have at least one last adventure before then. Man, Kristen really has turned you into a scaredy cat. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Steve relented. All right, fine. But if we get caught, I'm telling the police that you were holding me hostage. Deal, I said with a grin. I'll pick you up at 11 tonight. We set out to find a building tall enough, old enough, and most importantly, abandoned enough to perform the ritual. It took longer than we expected, and it was already 12:40 when we settled on what building to use. After a bit of back and forth between me and Steve, we decided on the Markham building. It was old, worn out, 18-floor structure originally built in the 1930s when Art Deco architecture was still a thing. It's mostly unused nowadays, save for the first floor, which I believe operates as an insurance office during the morning hours, though don't quote me on that. The rest of the building hadn't been leased out since the 90s. We parked a few blocks away from the Markham building to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As we approached the building, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The Markham building loomed over us. I imagine it must have been one of the tallest, grandest buildings in the area during its time, but now it was marred by years of neglect and decay. Steve and I had anticipated that entering the building might pose a bit of a challenge, as the first floor was at least still in partial use, but this still hadn't stopped us from getting into other similar locations in the past, though this would be the biggest building we'd ever forced our way into. We could see through the glass doors at the entrance that the first floor was still illuminated, as if someone might still be inside. I pushed gently on the door, and to our surprise, it gave easily, swinging open with no effort at all. Steve and I glared at each other with a mixture of surprise, excitement, and nervousness. Steve quickly put his lockpicking tools back into his pocket. We had been kind of worried about being seen by any cameras inside, but now that the door hadn't been locked, we were no longer very concerned with being charged with unlawful entry. As for all we knew, the building was still open. In fact, we were now more concerned about running into an employee who might question us and what we were up to. Cautiously, we made our way through the entrance, past the empty receptionist desk, and into the main lobby. It was not fancy. In fact, it was rather dingy and also appeared to not have seen any improvements made to it since the mid-80s, when the building had last been renovated. What stood out in contrast to this, however, was a large, shiny, new silver elevator located on the far side of the room. Half expecting someone to come up from behind, we hastily made our way to the elevator's metallic doors. "Why is it so new?" asked Steve, holding the flashlight I had given him, though it was currently pointless. "I don't know," I shrugged. "I guess Wikipedia was wrong about this place. It has been renovated pretty recently. Heck, maybe even the other floors aren't abandoned either." Steve didn't reply, but the uneasiness in his face was very clear for me to read. "Remember, you have to take the stairs and meet me on each floor," I reminded Steve. Yeah, I got it," he replied, rolling his eyes. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the first floor. As the doors closed, I could hear the faint sound of Steve's footsteps as he made his way to the stairwell. The elevator began its ascent, and as it did so, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched. I found myself glancing nervously in the mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking behind me, but of course there was nothing, just my own rather pale reflection staring back at me. When the doors finally closed on the first floor, I was relieved to see Steve waiting for me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Yeah, just feeling a bit creeped out in there," I admitted. "Let's keep going." I pressed the button for the second floor. The doors closed and the elevator continued its journey. We repeated this process following the sequence of buttons outlined in the ritual. Each time the elevator stopped, I was greeted by Steve. He was always able to get to the next floor ahead of me, as the elevator took an extra 20 seconds in the process of opening and closing its doors. I was also careful to never step out or for him to step in. I didn't want to do anything that could potentially force us to start over. We continued floor by floor, until I reached the 12th floor. As the doors opened, I fully expected Steve to already be there, waiting for me, as he had been on all the other floors. But there was nobody there, just a dark, abandoned office hallway. I didn't want to admit it to myself at the time, but I was scared. "Steve," I called out softly, and as I did so, that feeling of being watched intensified. I could hear my heart beating loudly in my ears, and for a moment, that prevented me from hearing something else. Eventually, I breathed a sign of relief when I realized I could hear Steve's footsteps echoing in the stairwell. He must have already started heading up to the 13th floor. I took a deep breath and pressed the button for the 13th floor. The elevator doors closed with a soft thud, and despite knowing deep down that this ritual was just a prank post by some internet goof, I felt a shiver run down my spine. To me, the ascent felt slower this time, like the elevator itself was reluctant to reach its destination. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by pitch blackness. The other floors had been dark, sure, but even then there had still been some light coming through the large glass windows that lined some of the walls. My heart was beating quickly as I flicked on my flashlight to see what was ahead of me. Even though I was scared, part of me felt disappointed when all I saw was a hallway that looked completely normal for an abandoned building. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a worn-out carpet. There were many desk chairs stacked on top of one another in a corner, and a trash bin that appeared to be filled with paper, but otherwise, there was very little else to see in the hallway. It was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the faint hum of the elevator behind me. I stepped out of the elevator, my heart resuming a more slowed and steady beat. I glanced around, again expecting to see Steve waiting for me, but the hallway was empty. I took a few cautious steps forward, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The air felt heavy, and there was still that lingering, unshakable feeling that something was there, watching me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my grandfather's old watch. It had been given to me as a birthday gift from him 3 days before he was killed in a car accident. I had brought it with me as my offering, hoping that its significance to me would be enough to satisfy whatever forces were behind the granting of good luck that forum poster had alluded to. I placed my watch on the floor beside the trash bin. I'd come back to get it next weekend, I told myself. As I turned back to head to the elevator, I froze dead in my tracks. It was gone. The elevator was gone. I know this sounds insane, and believe me, that's exactly how I felt at that moment, but the elevator was gone. In its place was a blank wall, as if the elevator had never existed. Panic surged through me, and I spun around searching for any sign of an exit. The hallway stretched out before me, seemingly endless and devoid of any exits or windows. "Steve," I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. There was no response. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Steve!" I shouted, louder this time. Still no response. I hesitated, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I needed to think logically, to come up with a plan. If the elevator was gone, then my only option was to find another way out. And that meant exploring the rest of the 13th floor. I hated the idea of that, but what else could I do? I continued down the hallway. My flashlight was quite literally the only source of light. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence was, for lack of a better word, oppressive, as if it were trying to smother me. I called out for Steve again, but there was no reply, just an echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that I was not alone. As I ventured further, the hallway began to change. The faded wallpaper peeled away to reveal old cracked plaster. The carpet disintegrated under my feet, leaving a trail of dust and debris. The chairs that had formerly been stacked neatly were now strewn across the floor. And then I saw them. The figures. They were distant at first, pretty much just shadows at the edge of my flashlight's reach. But as I moved closer, they became clearer. They were tall and possibly thin and completely still. I remember the warning from the post: do not interact with them or show fear. But how could I not be afraid? They were like nothing I had ever seen, and their presence filled me with instinctual terror. I have never felt that level of intense dread before in my life. I don't even know how to accurately describe it. Suddenly, I heard a cry. It was desperate and pleading, and the voice was all too familiar. "Help me!" It was Steve's voice, coming from somewhere ahead. Without thinking, I started running towards the figures and the sound of Steve's voice. I knew I was breaking the rules of the ritual, but I didn't care. Steve was my friend, and he needed me. As I approached the figures, they turned to face me. Their eye sockets seemed to be empty voids, and their toothless mouths were wide open, almost as if they were screaming, but they had no sound at all. I reached out to them, begging for help. I don't know why I did it. It seems so stupid now, but I was desperate and probably in some sort of state of shock, to be honest. They did not respond. They just stood there watching me as Steve's cries grew fainter and fainter until they were gone entirely. Then I was alone again, surrounded by the figures. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my side, and then I realized I'd injured myself somehow. It felt like I had hurt myself falling, but I know I hadn't done that. I sank to the ground in agony for a moment as the figures watched me silently. I could feel my heartbeat pulsing in my head, but I was somehow able to muster the strength to struggle to my feet, despite the pain searing through me. I had to get back to the elevator. I had to escape this nightmare. I stumbled back the way I had come. The figures did not interfere with me. In fact, they seemingly parted to let me pass. When I reached the spot where the elevator should have been, to my amazement, it was there, as if it had never left. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the button for the first floor and collapsed inside as the doors closed, slumping against the wall, my energy spent. That's when I felt the elevator begin to ascend. Panic gripped me once again. This wasn't right. The building only had 18 floors, yet it was already past floor 30 and was still climbing and accelerating. I struggled to sit up and reached for the keypad. My vision blurred. My fingers fumbled, but I managed to press another button. I think it was floor 1, but I could barely see, so I'm not even sure. The lift jolted, then began to descend. When the elevator finally stopped, I braced myself for what I might find. But when the doors opened, I saw that I was on the first floor, with everything as it had been before, except now the lights were off. Gasping for air, I crawled out of the elevator, my body screaming in protest. I had to get outside, to find help, but I was so weak and tired that I didn't think I could make it. I couldn't push open the glass door to escape. And then, by some miracle, a car drove by and saw me. A stranger rushed to my side, their voice echoing distantly as they called for help. I awoke the next morning in the hospital. The sunlight beaming into the sterile white room was a welcome sight after the darkness of the Markham building. I sat up, feeling a sharp pain in my side. I glanced over the room, wondering what had happened. The events of last night were so distant that I began to believe that they must have all been a feverish dream. Perhaps I'd gotten into a car accident. Just as I started to convince myself of this narrative, I noticed it. My grandfather's watch sitting on the table beside my bed. Its hands frozen at 1, the true 13th hour. I felt the pit of my stomach drop. Was it really all real? How did the watch get there? What happened to Steve? I had to find out. Desperate for answers, I returned to the forum where I had found the ritual. I posted about my experiences, hoping someone could help me. The responses, what few there were a mix of skepticism and concern, but one message stood out. It was from a user named M, the same person who posted the ritual. "Congratulations," the message read. "You've seen the other side, but remember, good fortune comes at a cost. The figures you saw are now aware of you, and they will not rest until they have what they want. Be careful. And whatever you do, do not perform the ritual again. I realized then with a sinking feeling that Steve must have been the object of importance that I left on the 13th floor. I had meant to leave my grandfather's watch, but somehow I had accidentally left Steve instead. I don't expect any of you to believe me, obviously. Heck, I don't even know if I completely believe it myself. I've tried calling Steve hundreds of times now to no avail. Kristen, Steve's girlfriend, keeps texting me, asking where he is. I don't know how to break the story to her. I do know, though, that I have to go back to that building. I have to perform the ritual again. I can't leave Steve there. I got him into this mess, and I have to be the one to get him out. The doctors say that I have to stay here overnight at the very least, but I can't wait that long. I'm just waiting for 11 tonight when I can sneak out of here with just enough time to get back into the Markham building by 1. I know this is just a forum to post stories that are preventing you from getting any sleep, but if any of you have any genuine advice on what to do or how to get help, please let me know as soon as you can. I only have 13 hours left before I have to go.